At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My name tag didn't say, grandmother of the bride, or even just my name. It read, the old lady who's paying for everything. That's how they saw me. If you're listening, I hope you'll stay with me to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I've always believed that family celebrations are supposed to be joyful. And my granddaughter Madison's wedding was meant to be one of those beautiful days you remember forever. Instead, it turned into the moment I learned what my family truly thinks of me. That morning, I took my time getting ready. I'm 65, and while I'm not someone who fusses over her looks, I wanted to honor the day. I put on a soft, pale blue dress that my late husband Henry always adored. I styled my silver hair with care and even dabbed on a little of the perfume he gave me on our last anniversary, right before cancer took him 3 years ago. I looked in the mirror and whispered, "You look beautiful, Margaret," imagining Henry saying it to me just like he used to. For a moment I felt like he was right there beside me. The ceremony at Grace Lutheran Church was truly lovely. Madison looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, glowing with happiness. My son David beamed with pride while walking her to the altar, and even his wife Sandra looked genuinely moved. For those few precious minutes, everything felt just as it should. But then came the reception. We arrived at the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Gardens Hotel. I headed over to the welcome table where guests were picking up their name tags and seating cards. A young woman behind the table smiled warmly as she sifted through the cards. "Here you go, Mrs. Lawson," she said cheerfully, handing me mine. I glanced down, expecting it to say, Margaret Lawson, grandmother of the bride. But instead, in fancy gold script, it read, "The old lady who will pay for everything, my gal." I froze. My hand stopped in midair. This had to be some kind of mistake. "Is something wrong?" the young woman asked when she saw my expression. I smiled as best I could. "Looks like there's been a mix-up." She leaned forward and took a look, her eyes widening. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Let me check if there's another." "It's all right," I cut her off quickly. I didn't want to make a scene at Madison's wedding. "I'll talk to my family about it later." So I pinned that awful tag to my dress and walked into the ballroom, cheeks burning with shame. Did Madison approve this? Was it David? Or Sandra? Who thought this was clever, let alone funny? During cocktail hour, I tried to keep my composure, mingling with guests who either didn't notice or were too polite to say anything. But then I overheard something that made my stomach drop. "Did you see the grandmother's name tag?" someone whispered, barely holding back a laugh. Sandra said they thought it'd be hilarious. Another voice chimed in. "I heard she's basically their personal ATM." My hands trembled as I stepped away from the conversation. Then I heard my son calling, "Mom." David waved me over toward a circle of well-dressed guests. "Come say hi to the Millers. Dad used to golf with Greg." I walked over, slowly, still shaken. Greg Miller looked vaguely familiar. Probably one of Henry's old business contacts. "Mom, this is Greg and Karen Miller," David said, then added with a chuckle, "Mom, our walking bank account." Karen's smile faltered as she looked down at my name tag. Greg shifted uncomfortably. I extended my hand and said clearly, "Margaret Lawson, Henry's widow." Greg nodded with a kind smile. "Of course. Henry always spoke so highly of you." He was proud. The conversation went on, but I barely heard a word. Once the Millers moved on, I pulled David aside. "What is this supposed to mean?" I asked, tapping the name tag. David laughed. "Oh Mom, don't be so serious. It's just a joke. Everyone knows you've got the money since Dad left it all to you. It's not funny. It's humiliating," I said softly. He rolled his eyes. "Please. Lighten up. It's a wedding." Before I could reply, Sandra walked up, looking perfectly put together in her mother of the bride gown. "There you are, Margaret," she said brightly. "Has David been showing you off? We just want everyone to know who made this beautiful day possible." She winked and they both laughed. I excused myself and slipped into the restroom. I needed to breathe. I stood at the mirror, dabbing at the corners of my eyes with a tissue when the door suddenly opened. A man stepped in, well-dressed, clearly flustered, then backed out in embarrassment. A moment later I heard a tentative voice from the hallway. "Mrs. Lawson? Margaret? It's Martin Blake, Henry's attorney. Could I have a word?" I gathered myself and stepped outside. Martin had always been kind to me and he'd handled everything after Henry passed. He gestured awkwardly toward my name tag. I heard, and the things people have said. I sighed. Apparently it's all just one big joke. Martin's expression darkened. It's not funny. Henry would have been furious. He paused, lowered his voice. There's something you need to know. Henry made me promise not to mention it, unless the day ever came when it was truly necessary. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. This is an addendum to Henry's will. He wrote it shortly before he passed. My hands shook as I opened it. The legal wording was dense, but the message couldn't have been clearer. The letter was short, but it hit me like a punch to the chest. Any family member who ever publicly humiliated me would lose their share of Henry's estate. And the estate? It was worth far more than I'd ever imagined. I looked up at Martin, completely stunned. Why didn't he tell me? Martin's voice dropped. He was hoping it would never come to that. He wanted them to treat you well because they cared about you, not because they were scared of losing money. I turned my head toward the ballroom where my family laughed and danced, not realizing their actions may have just cost them millions. Martin watched me carefully. So, what do you want to do? I folded the document slowly and handed it back to him. Nothing. Not yet. I want to see just how far they're willing to go. Back at the reception, that name tag felt like a weight on my chest. But this time I didn't feel humiliated. I felt something else rising in me, something steady. A quiet, calm fire. I needed to see the truth. All of it. The next morning I sat in my kitchen wrapped in my robe, staring at that awful name tag lying in front of me on the table. The fancy lettering stared back like it was mocking me. The old lady who will pay for everything. I traced the words with my finger, thinking of how Henry would have reacted if he'd seen it. He rarely got angry, but when someone hurt the people he loved, he didn't hold back. They've changed, I whispered into the empty kitchen as if Henry might still be listening. Or maybe they've always been this way, and we just didn't want to see it. I walked into the living room and looked up at the big family portrait hanging over the fireplace. It was taken 5 years ago at our 40th anniversary. Henry sat in the center, still strong back then, even though we didn't yet know the illness had already started. I was standing beside him with my hand on his shoulder. On either side were David and Sandra, and in front stood Madison and her brother Ethan, both still teenagers at the time. We looked like a happy family. We looked united. So when had everything changed? That question followed me as I made my tea. Maybe it happened little by little, so slowly I didn't even notice the respect fading away. One memory stood out. Just 6 months after Henry's funeral, David and Sandra invited me to dinner. That was rare even back then. They were unusually warm that night, checking in on me, telling sweet stories about Henry. But after dessert, I realized what the evening was really about. "Mom," David said, topping off my wine. "Sandra and I have been talking about redoing the kitchen. Nothing major, just new appliances, countertops." "That sounds nice," I said, not seeing where this was headed. "Well," Sandra added, her voice smooth, "with college costs and everything else, money's tight right now." There was a pause. "Look. Expectation. Are you asking me for help?" Asked slowly. "We're not asking," David jumped in. "We just thought, since Dad left you comfortable, maybe you'd want to help the family out." That night I wrote them a check for $30,000. Looking back, that was the moment the pattern started. A small kitchen remodel turned into a full home renovation. Helping with tuition led to buying luxury cars for Madison and Ethan when they turned 18. Then came family vacations that I was invited on, but also expected to fund. Later that morning, I pulled out an old storage box from the hallway closet and sat cross-legged on the floor like a teenager, flipping through years of bank statements, receipts, and canceled checks. The numbers added up fast. In just 3 years, I'd given David and Sandra nearly $250,000. Halfway through my tally, the phone rang. I answered without checking who it was. "Margaret, are you home?" Sandra's voice chimed in. "I've been calling your cell." I hadn't realized my phone was still in my purse from last night. "Yes, I'm here. Is everything all right?" "Oh, everything's fine," she said quickly. "We just wanted to thank you again for yesterday. Wasn't the wedding just perfect?" "Yes," I said flatly. "It was a beautiful day. Madison and Ryan are so grateful," she added. "It wouldn't have been possible without your generosity." I closed my eyes, remembering the $45,000 check I'd written to cover the venue and catering. I was happy to help, I said, though I barely recognized my own voice. Well, that's actually why I called, Sandra said, her tone getting that sugary edge I'd learned to expect. Ryan's parents were supposed to pay for the honeymoon, but his dad's business hit a rough patch and, well, they can't cover it now. Madison is heartbroken. I didn't say anything. We were wondering, Sandra continued, if you might step in. They've got their hearts set on 2 weeks in Bali. David and I would chip in, of course. I mean, with everything we spent on the wedding. Everything they spent. The words hung in the air like a bad joke. I'd paid for almost everything. I'll think about it, I said, surprising both of us. There was a pause. I could feel her blinking through the phone. Well, they need to book soon for the best prices. I understand. I'll let you know tomorrow. We hung up and I turned back to the mountain of receipts at my feet. My own private financial archaeology. Henry had warned me about David's view of money more than once. He thinks it can fix everything, he told me. But money without values? That only makes things worse. Back then I didn't fully grasp what was happening. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I peeked through the peephole and saw Ethan, my grandson, standing on the porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot. I quickly scooped up the financial records I'd been sorting and tucked them back into the hallway closet before opening the door. Grandma, he said, stepping forward and wrapping me in a hug. At 21 he stood tall like his grandfather, and he had those same kind, steady eyes. Are you okay? I've been texting you. I'm fine, sweetheart, I told him, smiling. Just a little worn out from yesterday. Come on in. He followed me into the kitchen as I set the kettle on the stove for tea. Ethan had always been different. Gentler. More grounded. He never seemed caught up in the family's obsession with appearances or money. I came to apologize for what happened yesterday, he said as he took a seat at the table. The name tag, the way people were talking about you. It wasn't right. I felt something tighten in my chest. You noticed? Of course I noticed. A lot of people did. He looked down, clearly embarrassed. I should have spoken up. I reached across the table and patted his hand. It's not your job to correct your parents. But it is mine to start standing up for myself. He looked me straight in the eye. Dad and Mom, they're not the same since Grandpa passed. Or maybe I just wasn't paying attention before. But lately it's all about money. Your money. What do you mean? I asked. He hesitated for a moment. Last week I overheard them talking about your house. Dad said it's too big for just you. That they could help you downsize. Just then the kettle began to whistle. I turned away, grateful for a moment to collect myself. As I poured the hot water over the tea bags, my mind spun. I thought about Martin Blake and the sealed addendum Henry had left behind. About the name tag. The money. Pressure. And now, this idea of pushing me out of my own home? Grandma. Ethan's voice pulled me back. I set the teapot on the table and sat across from him. You know what? I'm better than okay. I think I'm finally seeing everything for what it is. He blinked. What do you mean? I gave him a small, steady smile. Just that it's time for some changes. We sat in silence, sipping tea. I watched Ethan closely, wondering if he truly was different, or if that same sense of entitlement just hadn't had a chance to show itself yet. But in that moment I felt something sharp and clear settle inside me. For the first time since Henry died, I didn't feel lost in sadness. I felt focused. I wouldn't rush into anything. But I'd be watching. Listening. Waiting. And when the time came, I'd know exactly who deserved to carry on Henry's legacy. 3 days after the wedding, David and Sandra hosted a post-wedding brunch at their country club. I debated whether to go, but in the end, curiosity won out. I needed to know if what happened at the wedding had been a one-time thing, or part of something much bigger. I arrived at the Maplewood Country Club wearing a simple cream pantsuit. It was one of Henry's favorites. He always said I looked regal in it. Inside the private dining room I spotted familiar faces. Madison and her new husband Ryan, Ethan, other relatives, and some of David's friends. Mom, over here. David called, waving me toward the front table. Sandra, glowing in a designer dress that probably cost more than some people's mortgage payments, gave me an air kiss. Margaret, you look lovely, she said with a faint note of surprise. We saved you a seat. I took the chair she'd indicated and noticed I'd been seated beside Ryan's parents, who I barely knew, instead of near my grandchildren. The brunch was pleasant enough. That is, until Sandra rose from her chair and tapped her glass for attention. We just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and for making Madison and Ryan's wedding so magical, she said, her voice bright and rehearsed. And of course, a special thank you to Grandma Margaret, who has been so incredibly generous. Every head turned toward me. I felt my face stiffen. Sandra smiled again, this time with something calculated behind it. We actually have an exciting announcement. Grandma will be gifting Madison and Ryan their dream honeymoon, 2 full weeks in Bali. Light applause spread across the room. I sat frozen, coffee cup halfway to my lips. I hadn't agreed to any such thing. David leaned in and said quietly, "Mom?" I carefully placed the cup down. "This is the first I'm hearing about it," I said, keeping my voice even. An awkward hush fell over the table. Madison looked surprised, then clearly embarrassed. Ryan stared down at his plate like it might save him. Sandra laughed a little too tightly. "Well, we talked about it yesterday, remember? You said you'd think about it." "I did say that. And I'm still thinking." David leaned in again, this time louder, so everyone could hear. "Mom, don't make this into a scene. We've already told them they can book the trip." And just like that, something inside me broke. That invisible thread I'd been holding onto for far too long? It snapped. "I don't recall agreeing to pay for a luxury honeymoon to Bali," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "And as I recall, Ryan's parents were the ones who originally offered to cover that expense." Ryan's father shifted uncomfortably. "There were business setbacks," he muttered. "I understand," I said gently. "But I think we can all agree. It's not appropriate to make financial promises on someone else's behalf. Not in public. Not without their consent." The table fell completely silent. Sandra's cheeks turned bright red. I let the moment sit for a beat, then added, "Maybe Madison and Ryan should consider a honeymoon that fits their own budget." "Their budget?" Sandra hissed. "What about yours? Everybody knows Henry left you more than comfortable." There was the tone. That bitter, entitled edge that made everything crystal clear. "My finances," I said slowly, firmly, "are not open for public discussion. And neither are my decisions about how I spend my money." David reached over and grabbed my arm, tight enough to hurt. "Mom, stop. You're embarrassing us." I pulled my arm free. "No, David. You've embarrassed yourselves." I rose, smoothed my jacket and turned toward Madison and Ryan. "I wish you both every happiness. I'd be glad to help with a honeymoon, something reasonable. But we'll discuss it privately, not like this." As I turned to walk out, Ethan stood as well. "I'll walk you out, Grandma." In the lobby, away from all the eyes and fake smiles, I finally let myself breathe. My hands were trembling as I fished around for my car keys. "You sure you're okay to drive?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. I nodded and took a steadying breath. "Just a little rattled." "You should be proud of yourself," he said. "That took guts." I looked at him. Really looked. In that moment, the resemblance to Henry was so strong it nearly broke me. "Would you like to come over for dinner tonight?" I asked without thinking. Ethan smiled. "I'd love that." That evening we sat in my kitchen, just the two of us, sharing roast chicken and quiet conversation. At some point I found myself opening up about everything. His parents' constant financial requests, the subtle ways they chipped away at respect over the last 3 years. "I'm not surprised," he said sadly. "I've seen it. Since Grandpa passed, it's like they stopped seeing you as family." "An ATM?" I offered. He gave a small nod. "Yeah. And it's only getting worse. Last week I heard them talking about your house again." I looked up. "What did they say?" He hesitated. "They were trying to figure out how to talk you into moving to Sunrise Ridge, the retirement place." I just sat there stunned. That house wasn't just walls and windows. It was where Henry and I built a life. Every room held a memory. "Dad said it would be easier for everyone if you downsized," Ethan continued. "He mentioned the market being strong and how they could help you maximize your investment." I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just about money anymore. They wanted my home. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you," I said, making the choice to trust him. "It's about a letter your grandfather left. Something legal." But before I could say more, the doorbell rang. I glanced out the window and saw David's car in the driveway. "It's your dad," I said. Ethan's jaw tensed. "You don't have to let him in." But I was done hiding. "No. I think it's time we clear the air." I opened the door and David pushed his way in before I could even greet him, his face already flushed with anger. "What the hell was that stunt at brunch?" he barked. Then he saw Ethan. "What are you doing here?" "Having dinner with Grandma," Ethan answered, cool as ever. "Something the rest of you should try sometime. Without bringing a price tag." David's glare deepened. "Stay out of this. This is between me and my mother." "No," I said firmly. "If we're doing this, we're doing it with Ethan here. I'm done with the whispered conversations and backroom guilt trips. Let's lay everything out right now." In that moment, looking at my son's furious expression and my grandson standing tall beside me, I knew this was it. The breaking point. There'd be no going back after this. "I've had it with your attitude, Mom," David snapped, pacing across the living room like a man cornered. "First the scene at brunch, and now I hear you've been turning Ethan against us?" I sat still in Henry's old armchair, hands calmly folded in my lap. Ethan stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, face set in quiet defiance. "No one's turning anyone against anyone," I said evenly. "We're just finally calling things what they are." David turned on Ethan. "What does that even mean?" "It means you and Mom have been treating Grandma like a wallet, not a person," Ethan said before I could reply. "The name tag at the wedding. Announcing she'd pay for a honeymoon she never agreed to. Plotting to sell her house. It's all been happening behind her back." "You've been spying on us?" David shouted. "I've been paying attention," Ethan shot back. "Something you might try sometime." David turned back to me, shifting into that careful, coaxing tone he always used when he wanted something. "Mom, you're misunderstanding us. We're just trying to help. You're not getting any younger and managing money gets harder." "I'm 65, not 95, I cut in. "And I'm in full control of my mind and my finances." "But Dad left you so much." "Stop right there." I raised my hand. "Henry left me what he wanted me to have. And let me be clear. His estate is not some family piggy bank." David's fake smile faded. "So what are you saying? You're cutting us off because Sandra made one dumb joke with a name tag." "I'm saying," I answered calmly, "that from now on I'll be making my own decisions. About my money. About my home. If Madison and Ryan want a honeymoon in Bali, they can save for it, just like any other young couple. And if you and Sandra want a bigger house, well, you can earn it." He looked at me like I'd started speaking another language. Then his gaze shifted to Ethan. "I'd like to speak to my mother alone," he said flatly. "I'm staying," Ethan replied, just as steady. "This is family business." "Exactly," Ethan said. "And I'm family." I saw something change in David's face. A shift. A mental calculation. He'd always been able to twist things when we were alone, guilt-tripping me, playing on my grief for Henry, tugging on my need to keep peace in the family. But with Ethan there, that power was gone. "Fine," he snapped, storming toward the door. "But this isn't over, Mom. Not even close." After he left, Ethan exhaled deeply. "I'm sorry, Grandma." "For what, sweetheart? You didn't do anything wrong. For not speaking up sooner. For letting them treat you that way." I stood and hugged him tightly. "You're speaking up now. That's what counts." Once Ethan left, the house felt still again. I sat quietly, thinking of Henry, of the letter he'd left, of the son we'd raised together. Had we missed something with David? Had he always had this streak in him and we just never saw it? Or maybe we didn't want to see it. The bigger question was, what was I going to do now? And slowly, like an old photograph coming into focus, the answer began to form. I wouldn't wave around Henry's letter like a weapon. Not yet. If I confronted David and Sandra with it, they'd just behave out of fear. I wanted to see who they were when they didn't know I was watching. But in the meantime, I'd quietly begin taking my life back. The next morning I called Martin Blake. "Margaret," he said warmly, picking up. "I was hoping to hear from you." "That's partly why I'm calling," I said. Then I told him everything, what happened at the brunch and the visit from David the night after. "I need to know exactly what Henry left me, Martin. Not just that one document, but the full picture." He paused. "That might be easier to go over in person. Can you come in this afternoon?" 3 hours later, I sat across from him in his quiet, tasteful office, listening as he laid it all out. The numbers floored me. Henry built several businesses over the years, Martin explained. He sold them off at just the right times. His investments were safe, steady. They rode out every crash without much damage. I knew we were comfortable, I said softly. But this. Henry didn't like to talk about money, Martin smiled. He told me once that you married him when all he had was a dream and an old pickup truck. He never wanted you to feel like wealth changed you. No fancy handbags. No country club lunches. I laughed quietly, hearing Henry's voice in that. That sounds just like him. As for the clause, Martin continued, it's simple but strong. If any descendant publicly humiliates you, they forfeit their entire inheritance. The name tag at the wedding would definitely count. The brunch too, very likely. I nodded slowly. But Margaret, Martin added, there's no need to make any decisions right now. The clause stays valid as long as you're alive. I understand, I said. But what if I wanted to make some changes to my own will? Adjust how everything's managed going forward. Martin leaned forward. What kind of changes are you thinking? By the time I left his office, I had a plan. No dramatic speeches. No angry scenes. Just quiet action. Quiet freedom. That afternoon, I called up my old friend Joanne, someone I hadn't seen much since Henry passed. We made plans for lunch the next day. Then I stopped by the local community center and picked up a brochure for adult art classes. Henry had always said I should try painting. Maybe now was the time. Back home, I sat at my computer and started looking into small business grants. Ethan had once mentioned dreaming of opening a bookstore after college, but worrying about startup costs. That, I thought, was the kind of investment I wanted to make. Something real. Something that mattered. Later my phone lit up. It was Sandra. I didn't answer. The old me, the one who jumped at every ring ready for the next favor or guilt trip, was fading. The woman I was becoming knew her value. When I listened to the voicemail later, it was exactly what I expected. Margaret, it's Sandra. Richard told me about your little talk. I think there's been some misunderstanding. We've always wanted what's best for you. Richard and I thought maybe we could have dinner this weekend. Clear the air. Oh, and Madison said you were thinking about the honeymoon again. They really need to book soon to lock in a good rate. Call me. I deleted the message without blinking. Instead, I opened my checkbook and wrote out a modest gift for Madison and Ryan. Enough to fund a nice honeymoon. Someplace quiet and charming, maybe in New England. Not Bali. I tucked the check into a simple card, wrote them a warm, honest message and sealed the envelope. My quiet plan had officially begun. No shouting, no confrontations, just quiet, clear boundaries. And I knew Henry would have approved. 6 months passed in a blur of slow but meaningful changes. I signed up for painting classes at the community center, reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with, and spent a lot more time with Ethan. He came by often and we grew closer than ever. I even helped him get started with seed money for his bookstore idea, which was already shaping up into something real. Meanwhile, David and Sandra's behavior bounced between icy silence and overly cheerful visits that were obviously just cover for financial fishing. When ignoring me didn't work, they'd show up smiling way too hard, offering empty reasons to drop by, only to eventually bring up another renovation they were planning, or how Madison and Ryan were thinking of buying a house or their own retirement stress. Each time I gave the same gentle answer, I don't discuss my finances. I said it with a polite smile that grew more confident every time. They didn't like that. Sandra's texts became sharp. David's tone on the phone turned pushy. But I'd found something solid in myself. In the silence. In the strength of drawing a line and holding it. Today was my birthday. I was turning 66. And even though I'd insisted it wasn't necessary, Ethan had taken it upon himself to organize a small family dinner at my place. It's time they remember whose house this is, he told me with that same fire I used to see in Henry. I spent the morning out in the garden, trimming back roses, letting the rhythm of it settle my nerves. The garden had been one of the first things to fall apart when I started pouring my time and money into David and Sandra's demands. But now it was blooming again. Just like me. By mid-afternoon the house was ready. Ethan arrived early to help with final touches. You sure about this? He asked, laying out a tray of cheese and crackers. As sure as I'll ever be, I said, smoothing the front of my new red dress. It was bolder than anything I used to wear, but I loved how it made me feel. It's just dinner. But we both knew it was more than that. This was the first time in months everyone would be together under my roof. David and Sandra, Madison and Ryan, and even some of Henry's old friends, including Martin Blake. The doorbell rang at exactly 5 o'clock. David and Sandra stood there, their smiles so tight I could practically hear the effort. "Happy birthday, Mom," David said, handing me a supermarket bouquet. "Margaret, you look different," Sandra said, eyeing my dress, my styled hair, and the soft makeup I'd learned to apply in one of the community classes. "Thank you," I said simply, stepping aside to let them in. Madison and Ryan arrived right after, then Martin and another couple who had been close to us for years. I moved through the greetings and chit-chat with a kind of ease I wouldn't have believed possible 6 months earlier. As we settled in the dining room, I noticed David scanning the house, measuring, analyzing. Sandra kept looking at a landscape painting hanging in the entryway. "One of mine." "Did you redecorate, Margaret?" she asked, her tone suggesting disapproval. "Just a few changes," I said. "I've been taking painting classes." "Painting?" David echoed like I'd said I was learning sword fighting. "She's actually amazing," Ethan chimed in, proud as ever. "She sold 2 pieces at the community art fair already." "Sold?" Sandra blinked, genuinely puzzled. "But why would you need to sell them?" I smiled. "It's not about need, Sandra. It's about joy." An awkward silence hovered until Ryan jumped in and asked about the bookstore. "It's coming together great," Ethan said. "Thanks to Grandma. I've got the business plan finalized and I'm looking at locations." David's head whipped toward him. "Thanks to Grandma? What's that supposed to mean?" Ethan didn't flinch. "She's investing in my bookstore." "Investing?" David's voice climbed a notch. "With what money?" "With mine," I said quietly. David opened his mouth, then glanced around the room, realizing he had an audience. "Maybe we should talk about this privately." "There's nothing private about it," I said calmly. "I'm managing my own finances now." His face darkened. I could tell he wanted to say more, but Madison cut in, telling a cheerful story about their honeymoon to Cape Cod, the spot they'd chosen after I'd given them a modest gift. The tension broke for the moment. After dinner, as everyone drifted toward the living room for coffee and dessert, Sandra followed me into the kitchen. "Margaret," she hissed. "What's going on with you?" I turned, cake knife in hand. "First you refused to help with the honeymoon, then we don't hear a word from you for months. And now you're throwing money at Ethan's fantasy." "It's not a fantasy," I replied calmly. "It's a business plan. And a good one." She scoffed. "Don't be naive. Bookstores aren't profitable. He's using you." "No," I said simply. "I'm supporting my grandson's ambition." "That's very different." Her expression shifted. "Calculating. David and I have been talking. We think it's time you considered something easier. A smaller place. Sunrise Ridge has lovely senior apartments. And selling this house would benefit all of us." And there was the plan Ethan had overheard, out in the open. "This house is not for sale," I said, voice steady. "And my living situation is not a group decision." Before she could respond, David appeared in the doorway. "Everything all right in here?" "Just fine," I said, lifting the cake I'd baked that morning. "Shall we?" Back in the living room, as I cut slices and passed plates, David cleared his throat. "Before we move on," he said, raising his voice slightly, "Sandra and I wanted to bring something up with everyone." My hand froze on the knife. This wasn't part of the evening I'd planned. "We're concerned about Mom's judgment lately," David announced to the room. "She's been making some questionable financial choices, pulling away from the family and rejecting our guidance." A heavy silence filled the room. "We think it might be time to consider a power of attorney arrangement. For her protection." Martin set down his coffee cup with slow, deliberate precision. "That's a very serious proposal, David. Do you have any evidence of cognitive decline?" Martin asked evenly. "She's throwing away money on a bookstore," David snapped, as if that settled it. "A bookstore. In the digital age. And she's refusing to even consider reasonable downsizing." But instead of anger, I felt something like calm. A cool, steady stillness. This moment had been coming ever since I started saying, no. "She seems perfectly capable to me," Martin said. Making decisions you don't like isn't the same as being incompetent. You don't understand, David argued, his voice rising. She's always leaned on Dad, and then me. Now suddenly she's off doing irrational things. Enough, I said, laying down the cake knife. I am not irrational. I'm not incompetent. And I'm not your burden, David. Mom, come on, be reasonable. I've been more than reasonable for the last 3 years, I said, cutting him off. I paid for your renovations, your vacations, your cars, your daughter's wedding. I let you treat me like a bank account with a name. That ends now. David's face flushed, rage creeping up his neck. Is this what you wanted? He snapped. To humiliate us. In front of everyone. No, I said softly. You've done that all on your own. You selfish old woman, he hissed, standing so fast his chair nearly toppled. After everything we've done for you. David, Sandra murmured, tugging his sleeve, finally realizing how this looked. But he was too far gone. You think you can just cut us off? Dad would be ashamed of you. And then Martin Blake cleared his throat. Actually, David, he said, your father anticipated this very scenario. The room fell completely silent. David froze as Martin reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. Henry added a clause to his will shortly before he passed, Martin explained. He was worried about how Margaret might be treated after he was gone. What kind of clause? Sandra asked, her voice shrill. Martin glanced at me for permission. I gave him a small nod. It states that any descendant who publicly humiliates Margaret will forfeit their share of his estate, Martin said, his voice clear. That includes disrespect, attempts to control her finances, or pressuring her to leave her home. That's ridiculous, David barked. Dad would never. He did, Martin said firmly. And as executor, I've been documenting several incidents over the last few months. Then he turned to me. Margaret, I have to ask. Do you want to enforce the clause? All eyes turned to me. David and Sandra were pale, stunned. Madison looked embarrassed, confused. Ethan sat steady, his eyes locked on mine, calm, supportive. Yes, I said at last. I do. David collapsed back into his chair. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious, I said. The name tag at the wedding. The stunt at the brunch. The constant demands. Trying to paint me as unstable tonight? It ends now. But our inheritance, Sandra whispered. It's gone, Martin said simply. The clause is binding. All of it? Madison asked quietly. Martin nodded. I'm afraid so. This isn't fair. David exploded, slamming his hand on the table. She let us believe the money was there for us. No, David, I said quietly. You assumed. You took. You demanded. But you never once asked me what I needed. What I wanted. What about Madison and Ryan? Sandra asked, grasping at anything. They didn't do anything. Martin glanced at his notes. Madison was present during multiple incidents but didn't participate directly. However, she never defended Margaret either. Madison's eyes welled up. I'm sorry, Grandma. I should have said something about the name tag. I reached across the table and gently took her hand. We all make mistakes, sweetheart. What matters is what we learn from them. So, what happens now? Ryan asked, placing his arm around her. According to the clause, Martin said, David and Sandra's share of Henry's estate is revoked. Half of it now goes directly to Margaret. The other half will be split among descendants who have shown care and respect. All eyes turned to Ethan. He looked stunned. I didn't know. I swear, Grandma, I didn't know anything about this. I know, I said, smiling softly. Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become. David pushed up from the table again, his face twisted in rage. This is a setup. I'll contest it. I'll fight this. You're welcome to try, Martin said calmly. But the clause is legally sound. And we have plenty of evidence that the conditions were met. Sandra's voice turned syrupy. Margaret, surely we can settle this as a family. We never meant. Stop, Sandra, I said, holding up a hand. That time has passed. David stared at me. So that's it? After everything we've done, you're cutting us off. No, David, I said, rising to face him. After everything I've done for you, I'm finally choosing to stand up for myself. There's a difference. The gathering ended not long after that. Madison and Ryan left with stiff goodbyes and promises to call. David and Sandra stormed out without a word. Martin and the others made graceful exits, leaving only Ethan and me in the stillness of my home. "You okay?" he asked, helping me clear untouched plates from the table. "I'm better than okay," I said and meant it. "I feel free." 1 year later, I stood in the entryway of Chapter 1. The bookstore Ethan had opened in a lovingly restored Victorian near the heart of town. Morning light poured in through the tall windows, spilling across shelves of hand-picked books and cozy reading corners. Behind the small coffee bar, Ethan's girlfriend Emma brewed locally roasted beans and served fresh pastries. A mural I had painted stretched across the back wall of the children's section, an enchanted forest with hidden animals and tiny fairy homes for kids to find. Twice a week I came in to host storytime, something I'd never dreamed of doing just a year ago. Upstairs, the apartment had been converted into a residency suite for young writers, part of a program Ethan had created using his inheritance. As for me, I still lived in my home. The same home Henry and I had filled with decades of love. The garden was blooming again. So was I. The bell over the door gave a soft jingle as Madison walked in, pushing a stroller with her 3-month-old daughter, Henrietta, named after her grandfather. "Grandma," Madison said, spotting me near the window. "I didn't know you were here today." "Just dropping off some new bookmarks I painted," I said, stepping closer to peek into the stroller. "Well, hello, little one." Over the past year, Madison and I had slowly started to rebuild our relationship. After the initial shock of the inheritance fallout, she'd made a real effort to reconnect, on her own terms, not through her parents. Ryan had been a grounding influence too, encouraging her to think for herself instead of echoing Sandra's bitterness. David and Sandra, on the other hand, were a different story. After their failed attempts to challenge the clause in Henry's will, they'd packed up and moved to Florida, where David had found work through an old business connection. These days, our contact was limited to stiff Christmas cards and the occasional update filtered through Madison. "Have you heard from them lately?" I asked as she settled at a small corner table, gently rocking Henrietta's stroller with her foot. "Mom called last week," she said with a sigh. "Same stuff. Complaints about Dad's job, about the house they had to settle for, and how unfair everything is." "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said firmly. "They made their choices. I've made mine." Emma came over with fresh scones and coffee, giving the baby a cheerful coo before heading back to the counter. A minute later, Ethan stepped out from the back carrying a box of new arrivals. His face lit up when he saw us. "Perfect timing," he said, pulling out a chair. "I wanted to run something by you both." He launched into an idea he'd been developing, an expansion of the store's community outreach. Literacy tutoring for adults, writing workshops for teens. "It'd mean reinvesting some of the profits," he added, "but I think it's worth it." "I think it's wonderful," I said, feeling a warm swell of pride. As the two of them talked through details, I looked around the sunlit shop. This bookstore had started as Ethan's dream, but it had become something more. It was a beginning, for all of us. In the year since everything came to light, I'd rediscovered parts of myself I didn't even know had gone missing. I'd made new friends. I'd grown as an artist. I'd even begun to travel, short weekend trips at first, then a 2-week tour through Italy with a seniors group. That's where I met Claude, a widower from Boston with gentle eyes and a dry sense of humor. He called every Sunday now. Henry would have approved, I thought. Not just of the bookstore or the independence I'd claimed, but of the boundaries I'd finally learned to draw. He tried to protect me with his claws. But in the end, I'd learned to protect myself. Henrietta let out a happy squeal, pulling me back to the moment. This was my family now. No, not perfect. Not untouched. But real. We were building something from the pieces of what was lost. And that, in its own way, was beautiful. "What do you think, Grandma?" Ethan asked, drawing me back into the conversation. I looked at my grandson. At my granddaughter. At the baby who carried our future in her tiny smile. At the bookstore we'd built on trust and respect instead of expectation and greed. "I think," I said, smiling, "this is exactly where we're supposed to be."